My name is Tom Daems. I'm Associate Professor of Criminology at KU Leuven, the Leuven Institute of Criminology. And I'm very pleased to be here for the interview with Professor Cyrille Fijnaut for the oral history project. Cyrille, let's kick off with some questions about your biography.
Yeah.
You have a very interesting biography. If you look at your life course, those early years, in 1965 you started at the Dutch Police Academy in the Netherlands, but then in 1969 you moved to Leuven to study criminology and philosophy. So not only you made a switch in terms of career, but also in terms of country. Can you say something about it? What happened exactly at that moment? Why you made that choice, and how did this affect you as a person, as an academic?
Yeah. Not about, generally speaking, two reasons for that. The first reason was that at the Dutch Police Academy there was a lecturer in criminology, and he did his criminology studies in Leuven just after the Second World War. And to a large extent his class was based on the classes he got in Leuven. And he already at the Dutch Police Academy, he told me I should go to Leuven to study criminology. That was really something for me to do. But after the academy in '68, I went to the police force of Tilburg in the south of the Netherlands. And I choose for Tilburg because it is not too far from Leuven. So backstage I was thinking, when I will go to Leuven, I should now make up my mind for a police force near the Dutch-Belgian border. But particularly the experiences as a young police inspector in Tilburg, they convinced me that I should try to catch up with what was going on in the academic world, and then particularly in Leuven. In the city of Tilburg, 200,000 inhabitants, we were confronted in the end of the 60s with new crime problems, hold-ups, drugs trade. We were confronted with public disorder, and the police force and the leading police officers at the time, most of them went through the Second World War, were educated and got their training before the Second World War. For them it was quite difficult to cope with these new developments. And I, as a young inspector, thought perhaps they know at the university how you should handle and should adapt to the new circumstances, to the new movements in European society. And so that is why after a year I told the chief constable that I would try to take leave again, and then that I wanted to go to Leuven. So I asked for 2 or 3 years leave in order to be able to go to Leuven. And Leuven was for me, the attractive point in Leuven was that in Dutch universities at that time they had not really a program. They did some research, they had some optional course in criminology, but there was not a real program. And in Leuven there was a real program in criminology, forensic psychology, and also criminal law. And that was what it made much more attractive for me than to go to one of the Dutch universities, Utrecht or Leiden or Amsterdam.
Can you say something about criminology at that time? Because we're now talking about the late 60s,
69, 71, 72.
Which was like a quite interesting period also in the history of Leuven as a city within Flanders. Can you say something about that?
Several experiences where it comes to the program in criminology. On the one hand it was, let's say, a bit old-fashioned. It was the traditional criminology centered on the individual delinquent or the individual criminal and the way in which the criminal justice system should treat them. But on the other hand, with Van Utrieve and other people, they were more or less already got involved in the new criminology, looking much more, not so much to the individual criminal or person or personality, but looking at the institutions, the police, the prosecution service, the judges. And that was, let's say, quite a tension sometimes also in the classes. What is criminology in the end? On the other hand, in Leuven, that was more or less the societal, political context was quite heavy. I remember very well when I was looking for a room in Leuven, I landed in a floor with 6, 7 Belgian students, but they were all French speaking. And so my first meeting was that when we first met, in the beginnings of the academic year, the first question they asked me is, you are Dutch or are you Flemish? I say, I am Dutch. Then you will be accepted here, then you can stay here. If you are Flemish, you have to move out. So that was in the midst of the conflict concerning, I say, the split up of the Leuven University as part of the political conflicts in Belgium. And so I saw that the gendarmerie was still heavily handed, suppressing disorder or protest movements and so on. But for me as a police officer, it was interesting to see how they handled these cases. And then on the other hand, it was for me a huge opportunity because the criminology program was not that heavy. For me, I left Tilburg as the head of the subhead of the judicial service. I had 120 detectives around me, and then when I went to Leuven, it was like heaven. No responsibility anymore, only study. And Tony Peters, who was then an assistant in Leuven, he always said, Cyrille, in 6 months' time, you had all the library of criminology. So I was reading day and night in the library in Leuven, just to sum up, let's say, the newest developments in criminology. Yeah.
And you never felt the urge to return to the police or to practice it itself?
No, on the one hand, I must say, after 2-3 years Leuven, I was thinking about a career back in the police. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the experience in the library, seeing the new developments, particularly in the United States, I got familiar with the work of Jerry Skolnick, of Al Rees, James Q. Wilson, Gary Marks. I said, my God, perhaps I should develop a career an academic career in criminology. But nevertheless, I had no money anymore. I was forced. I had to leave Leuven, went back to the police force. I had to earn some money. And then I tried to establish a study center in the field of policing, but that was rejected at the level of the Ministry of Interior in The Hague. And then at that moment, some professors called me up and said, we are planning a project on the Belgian police system, a project you can develop a PhD. Are you not willing to come back to Leuven? And so it took me some days, some weeks perhaps, to think about this offer from Leuven, but I saw no new possibilities in the Dutch police system. And then I said, my God, I should do this. I have seen a bit what it means to do research, to write books, to knowing what is going on in the United States, to some extent the United Kingdom, France and Germany, and in Leuven itself. It is now the moment to step in and try to write a PhD thesis. Yeah.
Can you say something about your PhD research? What was the topic and what were the main
The original idea was to do an empirical piece of research on the way in which the Belgian police system at the time functioned in practice. And that was of course also the reason why they invited me to do this with my police background. But when I was walking around in that police system, highly divided, highly tense, a lot of conflicts, many police officers were always referring to the past. To say that has to do with the political past of Belgium. That is the reason why we have these very local, small police forces on the one hand, but also this quite forceful, traditional gendarmerie. That you can only explain that and understand this if you have any idea of Belgian history. So then I thought, I should indeed study that history. So then I started to collect materials with the help of historians on the Belgian political history and to see its impact on the policing system. And that took that much time and energy and so on. So that took me 2 years to collect sufficient materials. And at that moment, I didn't know how to analyze all those materials. And in the meantime, I had also studied philosophy in Leuven. And I wrote my thesis in the Higher Institute of Philosophy, particularly on the concept of truth, of Popper, but also the idea of scientific revolutions, Thomas Kuhn, the structure of scientific revolutions. So then my idea was I should try to mix up and to compare the development of police systems in Europe. I should try to construct a model and then I can apply that model on the Belgian history. So that took me some time, because that would mean that I should start again collecting materials, but I was so convinced that that was the right way to do, that I went to Germany, to the big libraries, to the United Kingdom, to France, to Austria, and I collected hundreds of books and copies and articles on the history of the police forces in Western Europe. And then of course the challenge was to construct a model, and that is what I did in my PhD at the end. And the idea and my conclusion was, if you look at police history in Western Europe, then it is a history that is completely dominated by wars, by revolutions, by coup d'etat, very serious, large-scale public disorder, and from time to time serious heavy crime. So that was, let's say, the conclusion. And then I should apply that to the Belgian system, but at a given moment I had no time anymore to apply this model to the Belgian system, and I have still at home 40 meters of books and documents and copies on the Belgian police history, but I hope I will have time within a few years to write now the Belgian police history based on that model I developed at the end of the 70s. But I just published the translation of a book on the development of police and judicial cooperation in the European Union, and the title is A Peaceful Revolution. And that is exactly based to some extent on my PhD thesis, because the police history in Europe, generally speaking, is a history of violence, of conflict, of tension, of war, etc. And the amazing thing about the European Union is that the Union and the member states of the Union were capable to organize an unbelievable, complicated, but also to some extent effective and efficient system of cooperation, but this in a peaceful manner. And that is to some extent the miracle I try to describe in my book on the development of police and judicial cooperation, in contrast to what happened in the 19th and in the 20th century up to the Treaty of Maastricht.
If we can still return a bit to your biography, you did your PhD in Leuven.
Yeah.
I think you were a few years in Leuven, a lecturer in criminology.
They appointed me as a lecturer in criminology.
And then you went back to the Netherlands.
Yeah.
What happened there?
There were three reasons. One reason was, let's say, a more or less intellectual conflict with my promoter, Rode van Oudrieve. He was more of the radical criminology, and I had my reasons to doubt about, let's say, the basis, the meaning, the impact of this criminology, and at a given moment it became quite difficult to cooperate. The second reason was a very personal reason. My eldest child is quite heavily handicapped, and we saw no future for them in the Belgian context, so we felt, my wife and myself, we felt pressure to go back to the Netherlands, where we knew what we could expect in this regard. And the third reason was, after my career as a police officer in police practice, after, let's say, some 6-7 years in academia, I found it quite attractive to go to a Ministry of Justice and to see how really at the highest level, in any case in the Netherlands, policies are being developed, what the foundations of these policies is, and so on. And my idea was, it is important for all of us that we will live under the rule of law in a decently organized society. I don't see why criminology should not try to contribute to the well-being and the welfare of our societies. You should, of course, keep your own standing and your own responsibilities. And of course you can stay in a university and become a bit as an armchair criminologist, but that for me was not attractive. Then I preferred to go to the fire line and to discuss and to accept that there are conflicts, and then to see what we can achieve in that area there, at the highest level of policy making.
But then in the mid-1980s, you return back to the university.
Yeah.
And you become a professor at the University of Rotterdam.
Yeah.
And then you give a very interesting inaugural lecture on gesamte Strafrechtswissenschaft, geïntegreerde strafrechtswetenschap, where you return to the old ideas of Frans von Liszt and you discuss the history, the present and the future of the geïntegreerde strafrechtswetenschap. Can you explain a bit to us why this idea is so attractive to you and how this has also defined you as a criminologist?
There were also several reasons, but the main reason was when I studied criminology in Leuven, in my view, and particularly also the new criminology, they were talking about the police and prosecution services, but I came to the conclusion that in the end they didn't know that much about it. They didn't know that much about the institutions themselves. Most of the time they knew nothing about criminal procedure and criminal law. They were talking about it, but in my view they didn't know what they were talking about. So if you would make sense of a new criminology, it should be a criminology that can be developed and can be applied and can be taught in a context that takes into account the institutional and also the very normative dimension in its context. So I thought, if you want to teach criminology in a modern way to the people of these days, we should leave a bit this criminal-centered criminology. We should not only have a criminology that is talking about the institutions, but we should develop a criminology where you have, let's say, a constant fight, a constant search between the facts and the norms, and we should try to bridge them in one way or another. In any case, if you want to develop meaningful policies, that is the only way in order to do that. And Frans von Liszt was the professor at the end of the 19th century. He came to the conclusion, if you want to develop, let's say, policies that make sense, then in this field, then you have to base them on the one hand on the normative institutional context, but on the other hand they should be based as much as possible on empirical research. And that's triangle. Yeah. That was what it made attractive for me. And I tried to restart that again, because there was a bit the idea that had influenced the Belgium, the foundation of the Belgian schools of criminology. It had been the foundation of the Dutch schools of criminology in the 20s and in the 30s. That got lost in the 50s and 60s, and I thought I should try to restart this development. And the problems we are facing these days in Europe, in terms of crime, but also in terms of reaction to crime, they ask for a more complicated criminology than is usually, let's say, taught in the United States and in the United Kingdom, etc.
So if you then look back upon that inaugural lecture from 1986, so it's more than 3 decades ago, and if you look now at criminology as it has developed up to this moment, do you think criminology is far away removed from those ideas?
It has been in any case quite difficult to let's say to institutionalize that bridge. There are not that many in criminology, particularly if they are from the Anglo-Saxon world. They are far away from law schools, from law faculties. So in my view, and generally speaking, they have no idea of the context in which they are developing their ideas and do their projects quite often. On the European side, I believe it is more complicated. When I look what is going on in big universities in Germany, for example, but not too many people read German anymore. If I look what is going on in some of the universities in France and also in Italy, to some extent in the Netherlands, I see that they in any case try to bring together these two perspectives. But it is, let's say, a shaky business, all in all. But I always have stick to this, and when I got a new appointment in Leuven later on, but also in Tilburg, I'm only willing to come when I can teach classes in criminology and criminal law, just to fortify and to stimulate this whole idea. And indeed, if you look at my publications and research, quite often I did comparative legal research on some issues, and on the other hand, I was also heavily involved in all sorts of other projects concerning specific forms of crime.
Yeah. If you look at some of your work, a lot of your work has a deep interest, or shows a deep interest into the historical questions. And you are also somebody, and I know that, somebody who loves books, a collector of books. You even were like the head of the library of Leuven University at some point, and your wife is a librarian by training. Where does this interest come from in the history of criminology and crime and justice questions? And what do you think can be the contribution of historical approach for understanding crime and justice?
Yeah, to some extent that idea came from my PhD. When you wanted to understand Belgian policing system in the 70s and 80s with all these conflicts and tensions, without any quite deep understanding of its history, you couldn't understand what was going on. And so when you are talking about the criminal justice system as a whole and the way in which it works, if you would only look at what you see, then you will miss a lot of what is underneath in such a system. So to understand the foundations, the dimensions, the complicated issues in such a system, I came to the conclusion, yeah, you should indeed know a lot about the history of this system. So in Leuven, you know, we have this old-fashioned but very important central prison, built in 1860. I started my classes always by asking the students, you came to this classroom this morning, have you any idea of this building? Have you any idea of the concepts that make up the foundation of that building? How can it be that people build a house with 600 cells, locking up people day and night? That is a quite strange idea if you are a student in Leuven. So if you want to understand why in our midst we have such a central prison, that force you to understand the ideas upon which this prison is based. And so that step by step I got convinced that if you want to teach to students the actual working, contemporary working and discussions and conflicts in our criminal justice system, that you have to teach them quite a lot about the origin and the development of the system. And also what is of course very important, that a lot of discussions we have these days, if you are familiar with the history of the system, then you know that some of these issues, or many of these issues, they date back to the 18th century. So if you want to have an academic understanding of your own discipline, then it is very necessary to be very familiar with the origin and development of the system. But indeed what I did was my book about criminology and the criminal justice system. So it was criminology and the criminal law system. And my question was, to what extent all the ideas about crime and punishment, to what extent and in which ways they have affected the criminal justice as such, not only the ideas but also the buildings, but also the way in which they work and behave, and why it is so difficult sometimes to change them, to reform them. What is it that it is that difficult? Because these people stick to these ideas that make up, let's say, the existential basis of what they are doing, of what they believe, and the whole context of what it is based.
Yeah. Well, one of the advantages, I think, of the strengths of that book, Criminology and the Criminal Justice System, is probably that you are able to present history, the history of European thoughts on crime and justice in a way that we don't see that often in textbooks as they are now mostly used in criminology.
Yeah, I was very critical about these textbooks. Yeah.
Was it one of your objectives to show the world that part of that history has gone missing, has been covered, so to speak?
I always found particularly English language textbooks quite awful, because they are that one-sided, not only based on, let's say, traditional ideas about crime and reaction to crime, but particularly also based on ideas that came up in the modern contemporary American or Anglo-Saxon society. But on the European side of it, it is quite different. So the textbooks from the UK and from the United States, you can't use them in the European context, in my view. Second reason was that, in my view, if you look at these textbooks, that they had no idea of what happened in criminology in the past, and that they even didn't know anymore to what extent European criminology, up to the First World War, was more or less the origin and the source of the ideas that had been developed in the 30s and 40s and 50s in the UK and in the United States. And I wanted to redress the balance a bit.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things, I think, in the book, which you also address in some other publications, is the way you look at Lombroso, for example.
For example, yeah.
Maybe you can say something about it. The idea that Lombroso is sometimes depicted as this mad cheek, but you are able to present him in another way. Can you say something about that?
Also inspired by the ideas of Kuhn about the structure of scientific revolutions. Reading Lombroso, because most people who talked about it, they have never read Lombroso. They had no idea of what was really going on. But I collected all his books and the books of his followers, and then I came to the conclusion, looking at what was the development in the 19th century, and then the Lombroso theories and the way in which he tried to adapt, that is exactly Thomas Kuhn. Here we have a guy who tries to develop a new model, a new structure, and he has to fight for that, he has to defend it, he has to adapt it. Just in scientific terms, Lombroso is really a revolutionary thinker, and he has had a huge impact on the criminal justice system. People don't know it anymore, but he was, let's say, in the end preaching that we should abolish the prison system. The existing prison system said the prison system is not at all adapted to the personality of our criminals. We should develop asylums, hospitals, but we should abolish the famous prisons of the United States and in Europe, the cellular prisons. They are awful, they are completely in contrast and in contradiction with the aims they want to achieve. So Lombroso was really revolutionary. And the interesting thing is that in Europe he was more or less controversial, but in the United States in the beginning of the 20th century, the first national conference, 1999 in Chicago, they invited Lombroso. They saw him really as, let's say, an enlightenment and a guy who changed fundamentally the ideas about crime and punishment. And that is also true in my case. Doesn't mean that you should agree with him on all points, and his original ideas can be controversial, but in terms of philosophy and history of science, he is really a giant. And so that's why I defended Lombroso always.
Yeah. If we look back upon your biography, it's also striking to see that, in particular from the late 1980s, especially in the 1990s, you've been very active also in expert commissions. The Bende van Heuvel in Belgium, but also on human trafficking, there was this expert commission. Can you say something about that and how you see that kind of contribution, that kind of activity related to criminology and the role of criminology in a democratic society?
The reason why they invited me in the Netherlands and Belgium quite often to support or to be a member of committees of inquiry, to some extent of course it was based on the fact that I had this police background and I always was willing to enter the practice and to the field, that I was not shying away from conflicts. I always took my own responsibility. I always said, I will participate in it, but I want to write myself my books, reports and so on, so that I can defend my position in this field. But the reason why they quite often invited me was exactly because they knew that I had this practice, police experience, but in particular I believe that I was willing to enter the difficult grey area between academic research and politics. In the 80s and 90s there were quite a lot of changes and conflicts in Belgium and Dutch society. So there was a need for expertise to support such committees. But I always was careful I always said to them, okay, I want to support you and to participate in the activities of the committee, but I will always want to write my own reports under my own name. So that I always can, to the academic field, I always can explain what I did and can defend what I did. I cannot be blamed for what committees as such in terms of policy want to defend or concluded or deduce from their work. So,
what would you consider to be your biggest achievement in that sense? Because you did several commissions. Is there one particular commission that you feel has been really a significant contribution?
Yeah, I had two categories of commissions.
Yeah.
The one was really parliamentary committees of inquiry. The other ones were more, let's say, official commissions, but sometimes I was the lonely worker. So when I take the first category, I did 4 or 5 of these committees of inquiry, and then particularly the Dutch ones. I believe that the Committee of Van Tra, looking into undercover policing and the problems of proactive policing in the field of organized crime. Then I organized a whole research group with Bruinsma and Van der Bunt and Frank Bovenkerk, and we established, I would say, quite a comprehensive, in any case, not to say impressive, series of books on organized crime problems in the Netherlands. And in my view, because criminology in the Netherlands was in difficult conditions in the beginning of the 90s, but at that time, with this committee of inquiry, we could prove also for the outside world that criminology had something to tell and to offer to society at large, also in policy terms. And this report has had a huge impact up to this moment in many ways. On the other category of commissions, I believe there are 2 achievements. The first one was that I was inventing the so-called safety houses. I saw that in cities like Tilburg, one didn't know how to handle juvenile delinquency, but my idea was we should bring together police, municipalities, schools, social work, to see at an early moment to what extent we can build a positive perspective for youngsters who are marginalized and perhaps will end up in a juvenile or in a delinquent career. And so in 2003 I made a proposal in Tilburg to build a so-called safety house, a round table where all these parties take part, also the youngsters and their parents themselves, to see what could be done to give them a positive, constructive perspective in life. And that idea of a safety house has later on, in a few years' time, established all over the Netherlands. So you have now a huge network of safety houses in the bigger cities and in the regions, building on that idea that you should in an early moment try to intervene, but in a constructive dialogue with the youngsters and their parents to see how you can overcome troubles and obstacles to build a positive thing. My other achievement, so to speak, is that in 2003 the Dutch government didn't know anymore how to handle the cases of the new terrorism. There was a system of special forces, but that was not at all adapted to that. The ministries and the military and the police, they couldn't come to an agreement. How should we adapt our system of special forces? And then overnight they said we should ask Cyrille Fijnaut whether he would be willing to develop a system that is suitable for the problems, for the contemporary problems in the field of the new terrorism. And so then I wrote in 6 months' time, on the basis of what was going on in the Netherlands, in Germany, in France, and Belgium, and the United Kingdom. I went to all these police forces and special forces, and then I made a proposal to restructure the system of special military and police forces in the Netherlands. And that was immediately accepted by the Dutch government and put into practice. And that is the so-called Dienst Speciale Interventies, so the Special Intervention Service. A very heavy weapon, well-trained, well-equipped, very modern system to intervene in cases of serious violence, also in the criminal field, but particularly in cases of, let's say, suicide terrorism. That is what it is. Yeah.
Another interesting part of your research is about international and European cooperation, and you even taught European criminal law in Leuven, even though you're not a lawyer, which is quite exceptional that a non-lawyer can teach law. But how did you get interested in those topics, especially because in the 80s, early 90s, there was not that much discussion about this, and criminology was also not.
So I believe the class we established in Leuven in '92 was the first class in European criminal law all over Europe. I even got emails or letters from colleagues in the Netherlands and Germany. You are talking about European criminal law, but that doesn't exist. I say yes, okay, this in the making. It will exist in a few years' time, and we are preparing for that. But the background of this was that I grew up in Heerlen, near Maastricht, near Aachen, Germany, in the Euro region. And the lecturer in criminology at the Dutch Police Academy, he was the chief constable in Heerlen. And then in the 70s already he took me and asked me to join him to discussions in Germany to talk about cross-border crime and cross-border cooperation. And so then I got interested in what was going on in these border areas. And when I went later on to the Ministry of Justice, it was in the 80s, then I was confronted and challenged by lawyers and other people who were involved in building the Schengen Agreement and talking about the abolishment of the border controls along the internal borders of the European community at the time in order to build this integrated economic market. And so they stimulated me a lot. If we want to abolish the border controls, the controls at the internal border, do we need at that moment compensating measures in terms of police and judicial cooperation? So there was a huge stimulus from the policy perspective in the 80s in the Ministry of Justice in The Hague. And so when I came to Leuven in and I went back to Leuven in 1990, and asking myself, what could I contribute to the development of criminology in Leuven? Then with my very good colleagues, Lieve Dupont and Tony Peters, we came to the conclusion we should to some extent go back to the origins of the Leuven School of Criminology, that really was a European foundation, and we should now grasp the opportunities of building Schengen, the Schengen area, and building the European Union. Leuven should join that initiative in its own way and in its own manner. And that is why I established the European Journal of Crime, Criminal Law and Criminal Justice, why I developed with some other people this European Criminal Law class, and took other initiatives to catch up with what was going on with these major political and institutional developments in Europe.
How do you see the future of this cooperation on the European level, especially nowadays with Brexit and other also in other countries, the EU as a political concept being contested?
Yeah, in my view, these days, I believe that it is a challenging environment for police and judicial cooperation, because it is all based in the end on mutual trust and the sharing of common values. And at the moment that becomes difficult by, for example, extreme, radical, right-wing or left-wing parties who try to force the system or to abuse the system, then they are really undermining the basis of the system. So that is, I believe, in this way we are living in turbulent times. And one of the reasons why I wrote my book on the development of police and judicial cooperation and gave it the title A Peaceful Revolution was exactly also to say to all these radicals, you are losing sight of the fact that it is an amazing thing what has been achieved, and we cannot just accept that you would destroy it for your nationalistic or extremist ideas or interests. So we have to defend this system. So that is one side of it, and I believe, looking from a Dutch perspective to, let's say, the right-wing nationalism in France, the Netherlands itself, Belgium, Germany, Italy, then one of my great heroes apart from Lombroso is of course Bonger. And Bonger wrote in the 30s a wonderful booklet, Problems of Democracy. He was very afraid of what was going on in Europe at the time. And as I said in Leuven at a given moment, when Bonger would still live these days, he would re-edit his booklet and write about the problems of democracy at the member states of the European Union and at the European level. So perhaps I should do that once, to write such a booklet. On the other hand, the Brexit is of course a challenge, but I believe that, let's say, the problems are, the biggest problem are for the United Kingdom. As I see the way in which the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police London, the heads of the MI5 and MI6 and the Commissioner of the Northern Ireland Police Service, they really beg the government in London to stick to this system, because they cannot, so to speak, survive anymore without this system. So it is a big thing in the Brexit debate, what will happen with police and judicial cooperation. I believe myself, most of the time they don't talk about it, but I have the impression that they don't want to talk about it because it is too sensitive. And particularly in relation to Northern Ireland. And particularly the border and the border control, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. I read on a daily basis these days the Irish Times, the Belfast Telegraph. I exchanged emails with a young researcher in Belfast University, and we came to the conclusion that it is so sensitive that they are not willing to open up this box of Pandora, afraid that it will have huge consequences, but it will have huge consequences. And therefore the last section in my book is about the Brexit negotiations. And I hope indeed that I am against the Brexit, but we have no say in all this. But if it comes to a Brexit, it is a mutual interest for the UK, but also for the European Union, that we will build, let's say, efficient and effective cooperation mechanisms that resemble as much as possible to the mechanisms that have been built up in the Union since the Maastricht Treaty.
You mentioned earlier the names of Gary Marks, of Jerome Skolnick. You also have spent time at NYU at some point in your career. So I assume you have some ideas on how criminology in the US has developed and how it has developed in Europe. Is there something that you want to say about that? Do you see some differences or some similarities?
Yeah, my idea is that I look at the United States and criminology in the United States and to the leading figures and the leading textbook. It is about American criminology. Criminology in the context of the United States. And when I look at the European context, of course we have this language problem, so you should master 6, 7, 8 languages in order to understand of what is going on. So that is, in my view, quite a handicap. But on the other hand, more and more researchers also in the field of criminology, they are quite fluent in English. So I believe that the criminology in Europe should develop much more into a European criminology. When I look at the journals, at textbooks, they are still, I would say, heavily linked to national situations, national developments, national issues, and it is clearly quite difficult for many researchers to cross the borders and to develop a real European criminology. So that step is still a challenge, I believe.
Cyrille, you retired 8 years ago, I think?
8 years ago, yeah.
But you're still very active. You mentioned already the book on the European and we discussed also the book on criminology and the criminal justice system. It's remarkable how active you still are. What are your current projects? Are you still busy writing something, working on something?
At the moment I am the chair of a committee, international committee, established by the the Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we are charged to look for the legal, perhaps political foundations of so-called humanitarian interventions. Take the gas attacks in Syria. The United States, the UK and France, they responded with missiles and so on to destroy the infrastructure for these chemical weapons. And so the question for the Dutch government and many governments is under which conditions, on which basis we have to support or join humanitarian interventions in cases of, for example, the use of chemical weapons. And that is at the moment my heaviest and most responsible activity.
Yeah.
Then, of course, as I said, I hope next year to write still a book on the Netherlands, 25 years after the Van Tra Committee of Inquiry, what has happened in the Netherlands, how are we going, what is going on in the criminal law field, in the field of organized crime, terrorism. So that should be a project for 1 year more or less, and then I will want to use 2 years to write a political history of the Belgian police system. It is more or less 40 years after when that idea came up to write such a history in the 70s, but that project is really on my mind. So I am now reordering my library at home, changing the stacks and the piles of paper, and so when the book about 25 years Van Tra is finished, I will start writing the history of the Belgian police.
That would close the circle.
That should indeed, yeah.
Cyrille, I think we're getting close to the end of this interview. Is there any topic or any message that you have for this audience that you would like to share with us?
No, yeah, as I said, I know a bit about the American developments. I know a bit about what is going on in Europe. I told you that we should try to develop much more into the direction of a real European criminology. But that doesn't mean that we should not, let's say, try to bridge the transatlantic ocean. So that has always been one of my main, let's say, ideals. Not just to copy what is going on in the United States and in the UK, not just to stick to old-fashioned criminology in the European context, but to build up a fruitful bridge and connection, and to make a fruitful connection between what is going on in North America and in Western Europe. But now, 40 years later, much more extended to the outside world, to Africa, to Asia, and so on. So the idea, what has also reinforced a bit in Leuven by building a global network of criminologists, I believe that is a very important development, and Leuven should do as much as it can to reinforce this development. We live in a global thinking, and for drugs dealers it should also be true for people in criminology and criminal law.
Thank you. I think we can conclude over here.